My name is Giovanna Quiros. I am the events manager at the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy. Price Presents is the USC Price School's premier webinar series about issues confronting society that shape our daily lives. Each webinar features experts from not only the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy, but across USC, as well as those from other universities, government, business, and not-for-profits. Today's discussion, titled Food Foolery, will be moderated by Jenny Cantor, professor at the USC Price School. Though the audience will not be able to ask questions verbally, we encourage you to submit them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and panelists will respond to as many as possible. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Jenny Cantor. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vanna. Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Cantor, Associate Professor at the Price School of Public Policy, and I'm very excited to be moderating this amazing panel. So let's get started. It's January, and people are talking about new beginnings and diets and the Super Bowl. But since a nerdy professor is maybe not the best choice to talk about the Super Bowl, today's webinar will be on the food and the dieting part. So we don't have a ton of time, but just an hour. So my goal in the next hour is two things. First, I would love for all of us to get a better understanding about why we, the public, are so confused about food and nutrition. And second, I'd like for us to find out what can be done about it, both what we can do as regular consumers, but also what broader systemic changes might be required. Now, I want this to be an awesome webinar for you, but I'm going to need your help. So towards the end of the webinar, we will have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So think of some questions, whatever you'd like to have answered, put them in the Q&A window as things occur to you through the course of the panel. And Vanna and the team behind the scenes will be collecting your questions, and we'll be answering them at the end. Okay. So let me introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Michael Gorin. He's professor at the USC Keck School of Medicine. He holds the Dr. Robert C. and Veronica Atkins Endowed Chair in Child Obesity and Diabetes. And among the many hats he wears, he's director of the Southern California Center for Latino Health. His book, Sugar Proof, looks at the hidden danger of sugar for child development and what parents can do about it. Welcome, Michael. Our second panelist is Dr. Anupam Bapu-Jena. He's the Joseph P. Newhouse Professor of Healthcare Policy at Harvard Medical School. In addition to being a physician, he's also an economist and the host of the Freakonomics MD podcast. His recent book, Random Acts of Medicine, shows how medicine really works and also how it can work better. Welcome, Bapu.
Thank you.
Our third panelist is Ms. Sheila Kaplan. She is a prize-winning journalist and former public health reporter for the New York Times and Stat News. Her work has been nominated for several news and documentary Emmy Awards, and she was also part of the 2021 Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times team who won for their coverage of COVID-19. She's currently working on a documentary film for ABC News and Hulu on a dietary herbal supplement. Welcome, Sheila.
Thank you.
And our fourth panelist is Dr. Peter Lorre. He's president and executive director of the Center for Science and the Public Interest. Many of you know the center. It is the leading consumer advocacy group for improving the food system and supporting healthy eating. And among his many past lives and prodigious work, he was at the FDA as Associate Commissioner for Public Health Strategy and Analysis, worked on many food, drug, device issues. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get started. Food, right? It's a big subject. It's kind of like having a webinar on love or bad taste in music. Like you could go on for days. So we're going to need to narrow things down a little bit. And you all are in different lines of work with some relationship to food and nutrition. So I'm going to ask each of you, starting with Sheila, what confusion related to food or dieting do you see most frequently? So like, what's the one misconception that annoys you the most that you really, really want to clear up?
Okay. When people see the word natural, they think something is healthy or safe. And that is not always true. Arsenic is natural, lead is natural. You don't want to eat them. And I think, that's that can be very dangerous. And the other thing is that too many people think that if a product is on the market, it's safe. So people assume that dietary supplements are safe, herbs are safe. People don't realize that the FDA doesn't test many things at all.
Hey, thank you, Sheila. All right, let's go to Michael.
Yes, thank you and welcome. Thanks for having me on this panel. It's a long list, but I think the first thing that came to mind when you started saying that was just that there's so many dominant voices and dominant views on this or that diet being the diet. I think at the end of the day, there's not going to be one diet for everybody. I think everybody has their own unique issues, their own dietary preferences, their own taste preferences, their own health issues. So I think there's not going to be one diet or one supplement that's going to be a magic bullet for everybody. I think there's too much variation and individual needs for that to be the case.
Thank you, Michael. So Sheila, definitely on the branding, there's sort of some marketing issues. Michael, heterogeneity, just people are just very different. So there's no single right answer. Bapu, what do you think? What's your bugaboo?
First of all, I never thought a webinar would make me hungry, but now I'm hungry. Talking about food. I would almost step back a little. I think food is part of a broader conundrum that we see in sort of science and then the interpretation of science. I mean, you could put things like different forms of physical activity, other lifestyle behaviors. Food is just one of those things where there's a lot of interest in generating scientific evidence, but the quality of it is really quite low. And because the quality is low, it leads people to think that certain things might work for their health, that perhaps work, but you just don't know that they do. And the bigger problem for me is that if you find some evidence out there, it might not be good. And if you're not doing something, you think to yourself, well, I'm doing something wrong because I'm not following the keto diet or this particular diet, when in fact, that may not be true at all. So I think people have to have a little grace and say, what's out there may not be correct.
Yeah. So just acknowledge the uncertainty, lack of knowledge. Peter.
Oh, where to start, really? I'll start where Sheila began, is with the dietary supplement industry. I mean, this is just a very, very frustrating industry. I mean, 1994 was about a $4 billion industry. Now it's about a $60 billion industry with thousands of products that have come on the market. Very few of them have any evidence at all, and those that do mostly prove that they don't do anything at all. And yet people are forking out $60 billion out of their back pockets, right? No insurance, for these products that aren't doing them any good. And they have a belief somehow that dietary supplements are somehow, I don't know what, countercultural, sticking it to the man. I'm not sure quite what it is. But there's some idea that, even though these products are often poorly made, barely regulated, and, awash in claims that can't be supported, that somehow that's better than a drug. That's just extraordinary to me. And part of the reason is that you get a little bottle and it's got a bucolic label of a cow and in a red barn. And somehow that, conveys credibility to people, when instead they should be listening to Bapu, who's telling you that what you really need is evidence.
Right. So everyone, listen to Bapu. So just want to follow up on a couple of different threads here. So so let me just throw this out here. As I was thinking about this, good, bad things, which is what we think about chocolate, maybe good, maybe bad. Does it make sense to talk about something as, would you be willing to say, are there unambiguously bad things? So Peter, you talked about things that, are on the market, but that don't have any effect, maybe don't have the anticipated effect. For any of you, are there unambiguously bad things, some hill you're willing to die on, where you're willing to say, absolutely no one should be eating lard or bangers and mash? Peter, I'll start with you, since you brought this.
I have the right accent for this, so I'll speak up for bangers. Look, the truth is that, with the exception of, a carcinogen that gets by the FDA, and some do, most things in moderation are going to be okay. That's the difficult part. I mean, the real challenge here is to convey to people the complexity of diet, to somehow, on the one hand, push them in the direction of those things and that are likely to benefit them, like more fruit and vegetables, legumes, so on, less in the direction of red meat. But at the same time, not be so rigid about it that people feel guilty with every bite that they place in their mouths. That's the difficult part. On the one hand, you want to push them overall in the right direction. On the other hand, you don't want them to obsess about each of the elements of that direction. That's complicated, and it's hard to control.
Michael, do you want to talk more about, you introduced the issue of complexity and heterogeneity. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Well, if it's okay, I can just follow up on what Peter was saying, because in response to your question, I don't know if I could pick any one particular item, but I did write a book about sugar because, especially for children, sugar has so many detrimental effects. But that's not to say that children or adults should never eat sugar again, because let's not forget also that food is meant to be enjoyed and is part of our culture. So we also shouldn't lose sight of that. So the whole sugar-proof philosophy is to help parents be more aware of hidden sugars and the effects of sugars on kids' development, so that they can basically navigate through the very complex food environment. So if I had to choose one thing, it would be sugars, and that also now includes dietary non-nutritive sweeteners, which are kind of infiltrating the food supply as well very rapidly and have multiple detrimental effects. So I think for me, if it's one thing, it would be sugars and sweetness of foods, but not to the point of saying you should never eat sugar again. Just kind of modifying as best as possible.
I see. Just one quick follow-up on that. So does that also include complex carbohydrates, or is it mostly around just simple sugars, your recommendation?
I'm mostly talking about added sugars, to be even more specific. 70 to 80% of processed foods contain some type of added sugar. So then this gets into the whole issue of processed foods versus real foods. So hard to beat real foods as a way to meet a healthy diet.
Thank you. I hope to get to the processing part later on in the seminar. Sheila, Bapu, any additional thoughts?
One thing that I found very disturbing was going to the one of the Nutrition Association expos, where the Sugar Association had a coloring book for kids that they were giving out, and it was built around a trip with two characters, sugar cane and sugar beet. And they said, sugar cane would say, "Hello, we make food with lots of vitamins and minerals, taste good. And sprinkle sugar on carrots and peas, or add it to fruit salad or vegetables." And then sugar beet would say, "Yes, because it's all natural, you can consume it with confidence."
Wow. I think I just saw Michael's head blow up just then, but Bapu, any thoughts?
I'd like to see a copy of that.
The other thing I would kind of throw into the mix would be alcohol. I think most people agree that in high amounts, alcohol is not good for you for a number of different reasons. But the jury is a little bit out on whether or not moderate amounts of alcohol are good or bad for you, because there's a number of epidemiologic studies that suggest a beneficial association. But then there's other studies which rely on genetic variants in some individuals that make it distasteful for them to take alcohol. For example, if you have a flushing reaction when you take alcohol, and that's sort of random, and your cousin doesn't have that reaction, or someone who's the same race and ethnicity as you does not have that reaction, but you do, two things might be true. One is you might be less likely to take alcohol, and two is that might confer some benefit to you, which is what some studies suggest. So that's an area where I think there's a little bit of an issue of interpreting the evidence, but one where at high levels, I'd be worried about a lot of consumption.
Great, thank you. So nothing, outside of a carcinogen to rule out, but some things maybe to be a little bit more wary about. So we covered, thank you for that. We've covered a lot of different types of misconceptions related to dietary supplements, certain kinds of foods, certain kinds of diets. And I think that's just really the tip of the iceberg. And so my next question is, why are there so many misconceptions? And so there are sort of big systemic issues and also lower level issues, but I'll start with Michael with sort of maybe Bapu alluded to this too, does this have to do with sort of the state of our science? Like our current biomedical models, are we kind of in the equivalent of like the bloodletting leach stage with nutrition science? And that's why we're seeing all this nonsense as well as hopefully, sense with evidence?
I think there's probably multiple factors at play. I mean, the science is very difficult in this space, trying to prove that some particular diet or even some particular dietary factor is healthy or not across the life course is extremely difficult. I mean, the ultimate test is a randomized clinical trial, but, you can't do a randomized clinical trial for 20, 30, or 40 years, modifying one particular aspect of the diet and keeping everything else constant. So the studies are just very difficult and very expensive to do. So we often get mixed findings, discrepant findings, and you can't just look at one particular study, even if it is a robust trial, because there may be confounding factors, there may be limitations, and so the study of nutrition science, to do those studies is extremely difficult. In some cases, I might even say impossible. If you wanted to look, let's say, at the lifelong effect of diet X versus diet Y, you just can't do such a study. So we have to kind of look at the bigger picture, and that's complicated, and there's not an easy answer. But yet, on the other hand, we have loud voices on Instagram and social media proclaiming this or that diet or this or that supplement is the best thing since sliced bread. And those people could have millions and millions of followers, and suddenly, you've made a dietary trend happen without any particular science behind it.
So it's just really, really hard to do the kinds of ideal trials that we would want. And I want to get back to that in a second. But I just want to ask Peter, Bapu, you're both physicians. How would you assess the current state of the science itself, sort of separate from research design issues?
Well, I spend more of my life on drugs than on food. That maybe doesn't quite sound right, but I know what you mean. You know what I mean. So when I sort of came more to the nutrition field, I have to say that there's overall a kind of a sinking feeling that you feel when you come into this area. And some of it is for the reasons that Michael gave, that it's just very difficult to do these studies. They need a lot of people. You have to follow them all the time. Unlike drugs, there are substitution effects where somebody eats a bit less of this, they'll eat a bit more of that, and vice versa. And most of it is ascertained through these questionnaires that depend in turn on dietary recall, and people's recall isn't very good. So all of those things make it difficult. But overall, though, compared to other scientific areas, I do think often the science is weaker. I think the randomized trial, though, is finally making inroads into nutrition. Just in the last 10 or so years, I think that these studies that were said to be impossible in nutrition, people are suddenly finding a way. And we're getting more of them. And oftentimes they turn out to debunk what the observational studies had actually seemed to show. So, the parade of negative randomized trials of vitamins, for example, is, practically endless, after a previous parade of observational studies that seem to suggest benefit. So what I really find hard to take really is, given all of this, given all of the difficulty, given all of the experience that we have, why so many people are so sure. That's the part that I find frustrating. If the evidence is weak, then you have to acknowledge that. And you shouldn't speak as loudly as people do. You should speak in proportion to the strength of the evidence underlying what you're saying. but people feel an obligation to provide strong answers. There's a market for it for sure on the internet. And as a result, people respond, and we get a lot of people who appear to be sure of themselves. It's just that they might be wrong.
Yeah, I could applaud there, but
or they have a conflict or a vested interest.
Yeah, stay tuned. We will get to that. So relatedly, I know, Bapu, back in the day, I saw, as we're sort of talking about science and how we're accumulating knowledge and just how hard it is. But back in the day, I saw you on Med Twitter before Twitter kind of, took a turn. And I saw you tweet some pretty choice things about nutrition science. Could you talk more about your critiques of food studies, how they're designed? We've just heard it's just really hard to even do an RCT where people can, where you can actually control diets over long periods of time. What other sort of design issues do you have a bee in your bonnet about?
First of all, I thought I deleted those tweets. That's a second. I mean, I think that, this is alluding to what Michael said. Fundamentally, it's a difficult problem to study using observational data. So, for example, if you look at people who eat a Mediterranean diet and you compare them to people who don't, and you try to ascribe any differences in health outcomes between those two groups to the diet that one group ate, we got to make sure that they're not doing other things differently. Maybe they are taking their medications regularly. Maybe they're exercising more. Maybe they're sleeping better. There's lots of different things that they could be doing which precludes you from saying, oh, this Mediterranean diet caused these health outcomes. The way that we typically try to address this problem, which is sort of endemic in nutritional science and sort of all the literature on looking at how lifestyle behaviors affect health outcomes, is you do a randomized trial. Now, Michael's point is a great one, is that could you really say, I'm going to vary this one nutritional exposure in one group of people and measure it for 30 years? I think that would be impossible to do, or at least really difficult. But I think that there are paths forward. For example, there's a lot of surrogates that we think are important to health. So you could look at things like cholesterol panels, weight, adiposity, blood pressure. So I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that we can get good insights into what might be the health effects of diets or other lifestyle behaviors in a randomized trial context. The other point that I would make, though, is that really it's about incentives. You think about, why does a drug company create a randomized controlled trial? They do it because they're required to do so. They have an evidentiary requirement that says, look, if you want to sell your drug, you've got to provide this information. So who has the incentive to provide information about the Mediterranean diet? Nobody does. So this is really a place where I think governments can come in and really, meet the challenge. They haven't done a great job of that yet, even though this is, to me, like an incredibly important thing. It's something that people think about all the time. What should I eat? How much should I exercise? How should I exercise? Those are sort of fundamental questions where there's no private entity that has the incentive to develop that knowledge.
Thank you for bringing that in. There's no big broccoli isn't out there sort of running the trials, right? So, but now I'm a little worried. Like, does that mean, the fact that, it's just hard to control what people eat over long periods of time? Does that mean that we just can't know, or what's the second best here? Michael, what do you think is the second best in terms of how we can make progress in this area?
Well, I don't know. I think what's second best? What do you mean?
We can't get the RCT that we want for 40 years. What can we?
Well, it's a combination. You have to look at that's what I was saying. You have to look at the kind of entirety. I mean, including even animal studies, which are somewhat still informative in terms of mechanisms. And, that's what makes it so complicated, is because once you start to look at the kind of entirety of the evidence, from trials at the top to animal studies at the lower end of the evidence base, it's always going to be a little muddy in terms of what the data is actually pointing to. So I think cohort studies have been very good, which are not informative on absolute causation, but do show association. I think cohort studies are good, but you have to follow people for a long time, and that's difficult. And there's been some great examples of long-term cohort studies in big populations that have been really super informative in terms of diet, because also, like I mentioned earlier, it's not going to be one size fits all. So you have to look at, as Papu said, other contextual factors like what type, what demographics, what other environments, and so on were also involved. So I don't know if there is an absolute choice for the second level, but it's probably association cohort studies and looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah, I'm kind of getting the sense that maybe multiple pieces of evidence that point the same direction, different outcome measures might be informative, given that we can't sort of get to the gold standard of research that we might want. So this has been all really great, focusing on researchers and healthcare providers. I would now like to bring in Sheila and have her talk a little bit about the role of journalists and reporters. I mean, most people are not sitting around reading for fun JAMA or New England Journal. They're getting the news from people like you, and they read one day coffee is good, another day coffee causes cancer. How should we think about the role of journalists, and how well do you think journalists are doing in this area?
I think the large newspapers are doing very well. I think they realize how important coverage is of nutrition. And I think in the last few years, I've seen them move away from highlighting, the new study, dark chocolate great, dark chocolate bad. You'll see less of that in the Post, the Times, and the TV broadcasts tend to follow what the newspapers do. I think, but I think one thing that isn't happening as much as I'd like to see is, when reporters cover studies, we need to report on the funding, and we need to say, this study was funded by the chocolate company. We need to give people that perspective, and I think reporters should cover peer review studies. Make sure they're from legitimate journals, and point out the conflicts of interest. One of the things that I ran into when I was at the Times was I did a story on the then CDC chief, Brenda Fitzgerald, who had been a health official in Georgia. And she had made a deal with Coca-Cola Company to provide funding for an after-school program to get kids to exercise. And it was called like Georgia Shape or something. And it said, to solve obesity, you need to move. You need to have exercise and movement and eat lots of fruits and vegetables. But it didn't say a word about sugar. And when we wrote about this, she, got in some trouble and ultimately changed the policy. But I think that reporters really need to focus on what our old friend Jonathan Marks would call the public-private partnerships, and really help readers understand when a story is legit, and not to put people on or quote them who are just going to say, this is a great study. From now on, no one should drink, or no one should, eat a certain food. You have to, the people who call and want to be quoted are often the people who, as Michael said, or Peter, don't know. They think they're experts, but they can be wrong, and we have to watch out for them.
Well, thank you for that very sophisticated analysis of sort of what's happening in news. So at least one part, as I'm sort of trying to think through, so one part seems to be, we shouldn't be just running towards the latest study, right? That's the focusing on that is going to lead us astray. We reporters maybe need to be also focusing on the bigger picture, sort of what the state of the literature is, and not just sort of the news breaking event. And then, as you brought in, and I hope we'll get a chance to also talk more about with Peter as well, is conflicts of interest. Who is funding the study, who has a particular vested interest, and reporters really digging into that and reporting that so that the readers do know. One tiny follow-up on that from the medical folks I'd like to hear. Do you think that journalists, and this can be Michael, Peter, Bapu, do you think journalists accurately represent the findings of the studies? Are they doing a pretty decent job with that?
You may speak freely.
We're in the bubble.
I'll tell you something interesting. During COVID, of course, we saw a lot of misinformation out there, and we decided to do a study that looked at the prevalence of misinformation in effect, the traditional media, right? We looked at the top 100 sources, and we focused in on COVID vaccination alone. And we had some, Boolean algorithms that we could run, and then we had another portion where we actually looked at the articles themselves, looking for misinformation. Turns out that at least in these more of the traditional media, prevalence of misinformation is actually fairly low. It was much under 0.1%. Now, so there's much more that is accurate than inaccurate, at least when it came to COVID vaccination. However, that tiny fraction that is inaccurate, can be enormously boosted, right, by algorithms and so forth. And so the reach of some of these inaccurate articles was in the hundreds of thousands, even sometimes the hundreds of millions of people that you can reach. So that's the difficult part. If it was all misinformation, that would be one thing. You'd go after all of it. But if it's a needle in a haystack that is actually the source of misinformation, that somehow, becomes some giant needle over time, that's very difficult to stamp out. So I think that's a large part of the problem. Rare but dangerous.
Thank you, Peter.
I think the bigger issue is also not in the regular media, but in social media. I think that's where there's a lot of misinformation and miscommunication happening.
I would say the following. I don't have a sort of systematic analysis of all these issues, but my sense is that the articles that are written in the mainstream press, they hew pretty closely to what the studies show, or the studies purport to show. And I think the main step is not that translation. That, to me, is not the issue. The news is out there. The journal has decided to publish a study. I think that the major problems are, why are investigators working on studies where it is very difficult to say that something causes something else? So what are the incentives in place for a researcher to conduct that study? And then the second issue is, what are the incentives in place for a journal, sometimes a very prestigious journal, to accept that publication, or accept that study for publication? I think that more of the problem focuses there. And I think part of it is that there's just an appetite for this kind of information, whether it's high quality or not. It's just sort of like always in the news. We like to hear, you joked about coffee good, coffee bad. I mean, there's literally a study like that every few weeks, and they oscillate back and forth. You can't keep track. And I asked myself, well, why is that? Who's doing the studies? Why are they doing them? And what are the incentives that are leading them to do them? And I think all of that stuff doesn't sit well.
I think it probably, for the most part, operates differently than people think. So yes, there are times that there are truly dishonorable people who report something as positive when it's actually negative, or vice versa. Yes, that can happen. Certainly you can shade the data here or there. The larger problem related to conflict of interest is which questions are being asked. Mm-hmm. And the research agenda is being driven by these conflicts, and certain questions that would be unquestionably interesting to the public and of great public health importance, are having a hard time getting funded. But some other obscure thing that offers the possibility of profit, is something that will, pick up the support in no time at all. So the whole research agenda is distorted in the first place. This, of course, is not unique to food. And then you have, what Bapu is starting to talk about, what happens on the dissemination end. It could be that the New York Times is, absolutely above board and always accurate. And that was, of course, the case when Sheila was there. But how is it that a given study comes to Sheila's attention, right? Why is it that she hears about that? What is the engine that creates that? Some of that Jenny, I'm sorry to say, comes from universities, right? Which have got PR departments that are pushing sometimes trivial studies being done by their faculty members because they can get attention for the university by getting that unimportant study into the newspaper. And it's more likely to do so if it's about dark chocolate, right? And so you have an engine that is set up to often emphasize the trivial. And the journalists are responding to that. But in the end, what is received by the consumer is the product of all of these distorting forces. And what comes out the far end of the pipeline is something very different than what would be ideal from a public health point of view.
And so that seems to be like a gap that policymakers, the government can step into. But I wonder, sort of to Bapu's point, but I wonder, I mean, it takes a lot of money to run these trials. And I think many of us on this webinar know that the reason industry funds, say, the phase 3 trials for drugs is because the government just doesn't even have the budget to run these big trials. So what can policymakers do? Do you think it is mostly in funding, Peter, or are there other sort of regulatory levers that can be used?
Well, certainly from a claims point of view, right, what you get to say about a given food on the market, well, that is within the realm of what regulators do. Most of it is regulated by the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission basically regulates on a, quote, false and misleading standard. So you really have to go pretty far, right, in order to misbrand your product. So you can skirt pretty close to the line and get away with it. And one reason you can is that the federal agencies themselves, have been underfunded chronically, and so they don't have the ability to go after all the claims that they see. I mean, at FDA, I know we saw vastly more inappropriate claims than we could ever go after. And so what you would do is you would try to select, really representative infractions, right? Ones that either were a kind of infraction that many other companies were engaging in, or about a product that was, highly influential or sold very heavily in some way, where you could send 1 or 2 letters on, let's say, CBD, and then the whole CBD industry, you hope, would hear that. So, but all of this is a reaction, to poverty, in effect, right? It's a poverty of authority, and it's a poverty of cash for the agencies, in which they're always behind the 8 ball. And the companies know that, and they'll keep on pushing the limit because the truth is that they'll probably not get busted.
Thank you. Any other last thoughts on this issue before we move on to, maybe let's move on to the part that people are really interested in. So we've looked at all these different causes of the problem, and now we get to the part where we ask, what can we do about it? And just so you know, we have about 20 minutes to solve this problem. So while the panelists are thinking about this, I just want to mention to the audience that we'll be taking, again, questions in 10 minutes. So fire up your questions and put them in the Q&A. So I just want to start with physicians, the Peter, Bapu, Michael, physicians, researchers, nutritionists, other healthcare providers. Thinking about the different roles that people in the ecosystem play. So physicians and researchers, healthcare providers, what can they do to help reduce patient confusion? We can start with Bapu.
It's very confusing. I think what I would say, I mean, if someone were to ask me about a particular new diet or fad diet, I'd say, most things probably okay in moderation. Some things very dangerous, even in low amounts or moderation. But I focus on things like: are you physically active? Is your weight in a good place? Are certain metabolic parameters that we would care about, like blood pressure or cholesterol or hemoglobin A1C? Those things are not perfect, but they're sort of reflections of, in part, what you're doing with your lifestyle. What are you eating? And so if those things are doing well and someone's at a good weight, I'd say do what you're doing. I don't know that there's a magic fix here. I do want to mention one thing that I just remembered. There was a study not too long ago in JAMA Internal Medicine by Joe Doyle at MIT and others, where they looked at essentially the effect of prescribing food to people. This was just something that's sort of like a thing that people talk about in medicine, like the doctor could just prescribe a healthier diet to a patient and that might influence their health outcomes. And basically what they found was there's no real effect of that. So that's an example of something that feels sort of sexy, something that people talk about, something that observational data suggests might work. But if you put it to the test in a randomized trial, doesn't really seem to do much.
And do you think most physicians could be doing what you're doing, Bapu? Are they on the ball with, giving advice with sort of trying to reduce the uncertainty for their patients?
I think so, but I don't think this is coming up, honestly, at the physician level. I think this is happening way outside the doors of the physician's office. There's a lot of things that physicians spend time with patients that are not related to sort of diet and exercise things that are very difficult to control in a 15, 20-minute discussion with the patient. So I don't think that it comes to the forefront in clinical practice that much.
For me, I found and I hate to say this, the experience of a clinical, diet counseling in the office rather frustrating. People have a hard time complying for a variety of reasons, including the overall food environment, which is inhospitable and makes it difficult for you to comply with even the best medical advice, right? Given the plethora of bad foods that are around. But yeah, I just didn't find it that rewarding. People didn't comply as much. The results weren't as good as I wish they had been. And that's honestly how I got into public health. That's when I decided that if you really wanted to make a difference, you had to look at whole populations. And that, for me anyway, this kind of one-by-one approach was not really a good use of my time, or at least my skills, such as they are. So we put out a magazine that tries to do some of this, called Nutrition Action. That's one way of getting out information. But really, I think for us, it's really, I'm not sure that the solutions really reside in the doctor's office. It's a rather, I think, cost-ineffective way of trying to bring about change in this area.
Speaking of then, okay, so doctors, maybe they're off the hook for now. What advice would you have for the individual consumer? How, to the extent that consumers can do something. I mean, you mentioned a lot of the problem is bigger. It's just who's funding, who has the incentives to be doing these studies. What types of strategies have you seen be successful? Michael, I know you deal with parents and their children. Any advice that you would have for consumers, adults or children?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were just saying that by the time we get to physicians, it's too late. We need to work with communities and families in particular, if we can. So we're doing a lot of work now in our Southern California Center to work with community groups in collaboration, kind of a bi-directional collaboration, because they need help from us and we need help from the community as well in terms of designing and implementing studies. I think the days of research are just saying, "Oh, I'm going to do a study on X because I think it's going to work the best," are kind of disappearing, and we need to instead work directly with communities and say, "Okay, what are the real issues? And what is our best chance of success with an intervention?" So we need to kind of develop and design and implement strategies with the community in mind. But working with families, I think the message is to eat more real food. I mean, I think it's very hard to argue with that really at the end of the day, it's the overabundance of processed foods that are causing a lot of the chronic disease problems that we're trying to deal with. And one way to do that is try and get people to just eat whole foods, to make their own foods, and find ways to get families to enjoy the cooking process, to get kids involved with that process too as early as possible, so that kids can grow up with that culture of deciding what to eat and helping to prepare it. I think these strategies work quite well, as opposed to telling people, you can't eat that, you can't eat that. It's more about just trying to get people to eat whole foods, which I know it's not easy. It's time consuming. the perception is it's more expensive to eat healthy, but I don't think that's necessarily true. I think we need to kind of overcome that myth that healthy eating can be affordable, because let's also not forget about the fact that what we're talking about, the chronic diseases, obesity, diabetes, liver disease, these are very prominent among low-income populations and underrepresented populations. So we're really dealing with major disparities here that need to be addressed, and that's going to come back to federal policies such as WIC and SNAP that we haven't talked about that also need to be addressed.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. Super, super helpful advice. I think now is a good time to turn to audience questions. I see we have quite a few, so I apologize in advance that we might not be able to get to all of your questions. But just want to start off, actually, maybe on Michael's point of processing and the U.S. dietary guidelines. So what do you think about the U.S. dietary guidelines? There's some new recommendations about to be issued in 2025, and I guess the scuttlebutt is there's going to be a shift from focusing on individual nutrients to how foods are processed and ultra processing. So I wonder, general thoughts about the dietary guidelines. Should we, follow them slavishly? Are they just junk? Somewhere in between?
Well, I think the dietary guidelines overall are quite useful, not necessarily to be followed to the T, but I think the move towards processing of food and whole foods is a good one, because I think we've long been too long obsessed with specific nutrients like dietary fat, dietary sugar, but it's all about the whole foods. I'm also encouraged by the fact that dietary guidelines are also moving towards younger populations as well, because let's also remember that the whole concept of we are what we eat starts with what our mothers ate and what we were consuming when we were infants. So I think we haven't talked much about that. Early nutrition, also critically important. I think dietary guidelines are beginning to recognize that too.
Related question in the chat, what do you think of the food pyramid? Anyone? Peter, Babu?
Well, for one thing, it doesn't exist. So that's easily dispensed with. It's a plate now. My plate sort of set, flat, as it were. So industry didn't really care much for the idea of the pyramid, because it placed some things on top and some things lower down. And in their minds, that created a hierarchy. So we moved to the planar aspect, right, of the plate. But even that is debated. It's got a glass of milk on it. And that's probably, at least in part, the result of lobbying from the dairy industry. Why is it not a glass of water? That would be fine. So all of this is, part of what, USDA puts out. So I just want to go back to the dietary guidelines for a second, and say that I guess I'll go out and say this in public. I don't actually think that the dietary guidelines are going to say that much about processing in the end. My guess is they'll punt on this issue and say that more research is necessary, which, aside from always being true, is probably true in this case. The problem fundamentally is that there is no good definition of what ultra-processed food means. I mean, it's a term that people understand in the way that they understand obscenity or pornography, right? They know it when they see it. But when you actually try to define it, it becomes much more elusive, right? So is it the number of ingredients? But multigrain bread has a lot of ingredients. Is it certain additives that can't be added? Yes, but that can be helpful, right? At times, you don't want your food going off in a day or two. People are going to get infected. They're going to pick up pathogens that way, right? So there are, it just, I feel like it's a concept that people have a good intuitive understanding for. But when you start to think about it in scientific terms or in regulatory terms, it's a lot harder to get your hands around.
Great. On a slightly different note, someone was wondering what your feedback is on food journaling tracking apps like MyFitnessPal, Noom, Fujicate. Any experience with those and recommendations?
Well, I will say we did actually cover some of those in our magazine. Over the years, we have reviewed some of those, and I'm afraid I can't cite you chapter and verse here, except to send you back to our magazine and find it, which is what I should probably do after this call. They're very often very intensive, labor intensive. You have to put in a lot of information. And so that makes it difficult. And so it's hard to, except for the truly committed, to have high levels of compliance. That's part of the problem. That's really for devotees, I would say. But if you're one of them, the way you might be for a Fitbit, it might be something that could help you.
Relatedly, someone asks and gives a quote, healthy eating isn't a problem of knowing, it's a problem of doing. Do you agree? And if so, what are the key solutions?
Let me see the following. I don't know what the key solutions are, but that was a point I think I wanted to make as well. We had this study a few years ago where we looked at hypertension, weight, diabetes, things like that in physicians, nurses, and the general population. And if this is all an information problem, which guidelines, food pyramids, food plates, whatever it is, can solve, if it's just an information problem, you wouldn't think that healthcare professionals, like doctors at the extreme, would have similar problems as the general population. But guess what they do? Their weights are slightly less, but still significant rates of overweight and obesity, even within a very educated healthcare population. And to me, that data point says this is not an information problem. It's not that people don't know that Ben and Jerry's, which I love, isn't good for you to eat on a regular basis. It's that it's just very hard to do. And so I think that the path forward is really to figure out what are the barriers to doing the things that are healthy and how do you reduce those? And that's not an easy problem to solve.
I think it also varies. It's probably a bimodal distribution on that. I think there's probably a fair segment of the population that does not have the information that they would find useful on how diet and nutrition is affecting their health. This gets back to the whole issue of disparities that I mentioned earlier.
We have a couple of questions about intermittent fasting. What's your take on that? Is there, or maybe you think they're great and maybe there's a specific kind of intermittent fasting diet that you might recommend?
I don't have any diets to recommend, but I do know about all my cardiologist friends are doing it. So that's that is information.
Yes.
I think it depends on what your goal is in terms of for weight loss. I think the evidence is not that convincing, and it seems like caloric restriction is probably just as effective. But there may be some benefits on other aspects of metabolism that will be beneficial in terms of things like insulin resistance and cognitive health. So it really depends individually on what your situation is and what your own goals are.
Thank you. We also have a couple of questions on pesticides, GMOs, what should be done about, fruits and vegetables to wash out pesticides. Maybe I'll throw it to Peter first. And Sheila, do you have any thoughts?
Well, we don't so much work on pesticides, so I'll take a pass on that. We do work on genetic modification, though, and we certainly do not take a position that all genetically modified products ought to be avoided. That seems illogical to me. The National Academy of Sciences has already said that they don't see any evidence that GE products are inherently unsafe. So what follows from that is that each of these products ought to be individually considered. Some might turn out to be dangerous, some might turn out to be beneficial. But considering them all together, it makes very little sense to me. So what we need is a regulatory regimen that is able to look at in a risk-based level at these different products and assess them individually. And because there are undoubted possibilities here that could be clearly beneficial to the public health. I mean, what if you were able to fortify rice, for example, with a given vitamin, right? That would be a useful thing. Or, increase crop yields, all other things being equal, that would be beneficial. So we're in favor of responsible regulation of genetically modified organisms.
I think there are way too many herbicides and pesticides in food. I think the chemical industry lobby has managed to prevent the EPA from taking the action that the researchers there know needs to be done. One thing they've done is the pesticide industry group used to be called the National Insecticide, Herbicide, and Fungicide Association. And then they thought that's too scary. So then they became the Pesticide Association or something like that of America. And now they're the Crop Protection Association of America, which conjures these images of standing over fields of wheat to protect the crops. They're a very powerful lobby. I am not optimistic about EPA taking the steps it really should take, especially on neurotoxins and neurotoxicants, the chemicals that affect kids, the development of their brains.
Choose organic where you can is pretty safe bet, but I know that can sometimes be more expensive for people.
Yeah.
Right. Well, sadly, we're almost out of time, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to everyone's questions, but we will certainly make a record of them for the panelists to consider. And in the last few minutes to wrap up, I just wanted to get some final thoughts, takeaways from the panelists. So to each of the panelists, if you were master of the universe, what is one thing that you'd want to happen to reduce the confusion that the public has about food or diet or nutrition? Let's start with Michael.
I was hoping you wouldn't choose me to go first.
We can give you a pass. Sheila, would you like to go?
No. Well, I'll weigh it. I'll certainly weigh it.
Okay.
I mean, I think I would say we need to address early on in life. I think we've forgotten to teach kids about nutrition. We forgot to teach families about nutrition, as well as the medical community, which is getting a little better. I think we just need better information and knowledge in general and throughout the public on nutrition and how it's affecting long-term health.
I'd like to see FDA and CDC be better funded so they could do their jobs to protect the public. And I would also like to see an enormous movement to cut salt.
Thank you. Peter.
As Sheila may know, we have a petition before FDA to try and reduce salt exposure. So hopefully that will grant your wish. My additional wish in the area of information, which is, I think, partly what your question was, is we have another petition before FDA on what's called front of package labeling, which would summarize the essential information on the nutrition facts panel. That's the black and white one on the side of the pack, and take the essential nutrients from there, place them on the front of the pack with an interpretation as to whether or not they're too high in a given food. And we think that would simplify the information and allow even people with lower educational attainment to be able to make good judgments.
And Babu.
I'll just throw out a research idea as everybody was talking. Part of the challenge here is getting the data. And I think about everybody who's in the hospital. You know what patients eat because they order things on a list and you can see what they eat. They get blood tests drawn every day. So you could figure out things like what's the effect of salt on, measures of fluid volume in the body. There's lots of different things that you could study if we were just a little bit more creative than we are at trying to answer some of these questions. So maybe someone will do that.
Thanks, Babu. Hopefully NIH is listening somewhere there. So thank you so much for all the great insights and advice. We're sadly at the end of our time. I want to thank our panelists for a fun and informative discussion. And I want to thank the Price Communications team, Vanna, Gia, and Lansignon, who's sort of lurking in the back, but really was a prime mover behind this webinar. And if you're interested in more of these webinars at the Price School of Public Policy, the Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics, or the Keck School of Medicine, please check out the links in the chat and sign up on the mailing lists. And finally, I want to thank you, the audience, for joining in and for your excellent questions. I hope you can join us for the next webinar. This concludes our webinar.